Part 3, Acts of Racketeering Activity and Overt Acts in Furtherance of the Conspiracy. Continuing with Act 79, we have Act 79. On December 14th, David Schaefer, Sean Tresher Still, Kathleen Latham, and unindicted co-conspirators individuals 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 committed the felony offense of impersonating a public officer in violation of OCGA 16-10-23 in Fulton County, Georgia by unlawfully, falsely holding themselves out as the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from the state of Georgia, public officers with intent to mislead the President of the United States Senate, the Archivist of the United States, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia into believing that they actually were such officers by placing the United States mail to said persons a document titled, quote, Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia, end quote. This was an act of racketeering activity under OCGA 1614-3-5A XXIII and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 80. On December 14th, 2020, David Schaefer, Sean Tresher Still, Kathleen Latham, and unindicted co-conspirators individuals 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, whose identities are known to the grand jury, committed the felony offense of forgery in the first degree in violation of OCGA 1691B in Fulton County, Georgia with the intent to defraud, knowingly making a document titled, quote, Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia, end quote, a writing other than a check in such manner than the writing as made purports to have been made by authority of the duly elected and qualified presidential electors of the state of Georgia, who did not give such authority, and uttered and delivered said document to the Archivist of the United States. This was an act of racketeering under the relevant law, and it was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 81. On December 14th, 2020, David Schaefer, Sean Tresher Still, Kathleen Latham, and unindicted co-conspirators individuals 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, whose identities are known to the grand jury, committed the felony offense of false statements and writings in violation of the relevant statute in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making and using false document titled, quote, Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia, end quote, with knowledge that said document contains the false statement, quote, We, the undersigned, being duly elected and qualified electors for the President and Vice President of the United States of America from the state of Georgia, do hereby certify the following, end quote. Said the document being within the jurisdiction of the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State and the Office of the Governor of Georgia, departments and agencies of state government. This was an overt act of racketeering under the relevant statute and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 82. On December 14th, 2020, David Schaefer, Sean Still, Kathleen Latham, and unindicted co-conspirators 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, whose identities are known to the grand jury, attempted to commit the felony offense of filing false documents in violation of the relevant statute in Fulton County, Georgia, by placing in the United States mail a document titled, quote, Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia, end quote, addressed to Chief Judge, U.S. District Court, Northern District of Georgia, 2188 Richard D. Russell Federal Office Building, and U.S. Courthouse, 75 Turner Drive, Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, 30303, with intent to knowingly file, enter, and record said document in the Court of the United States, having reason to know that the said document contained the material false statement, quote, We, the undersigned, being duly elected and qualified electors for President and Vice President of the United States of America from the state of Georgia, do hereby certify the following, end quote, This was an act of racketeering under the relevant statute and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 83. On or about the 14th day of December 2020, David James Schaefer, Sean Still, committed the felony offense of forgery in the first degree and violation of OCGA 1691B in Fulton County, Georgia, with the intent to defraud, knowingly making a document titled, quote, Notice of Filing of Electoral College Vacancy, end quote, or writing other than a check in such a manner that the writings as made purports to have been made by authority of duly elected and qualified presidential electors from the state of Georgia, who did not give such authority and uttered and delivered said document to the archivists of the United States. This was an act of racketeering under OCGA 1614-35A XVI and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 84. On or about the 14th day of December 2020, David Schaefer, Sean Still, committed the following offense of false statements and writings in violation of OCGA 16-1020 in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making the use of a false document titled, quote, Notice of Filing of Electoral College Vacancy, end quote, with knowledge that said document contained the false statements that David James Schaefer was chairman of the 2020 Georgia Electoral College meeting and Sean Still was secretary of the 2020 Georgia Electoral College meeting. Said document being within the jurisdiction of the Office of Georgia Secretary of State and the Office of the Governor of Georgia, departments and agencies of state government. This was an act of racketeering under OCGA 1614-35A XXII and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 85. On or about the 14th day of December 2020, David James Schaefer instructed unindicted co-conspirator individual 15 to deliver to the office of the Governor of Georgia a document signed by David Schaefer and Sean Still titled, Notice of Filing of Electoral College Vacancy, end quote. The document contained multiple false statements. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 86. On December 14, 2020, unindicted co-conspirator Individual 4 sent an email to Michael Roman, unindicted co-conspirator Individual 7, and others that stated, quote, All votes cast, paperwork complete, being mailed now, ran pretty smoothly, end quote, in reference to the December 14, 2020 meeting of Trump presidential elector nominees in Fulton County, Georgia. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 87. On or about the 14th day of December 2020, Stephen Cliffgard Lee attempted to commit the felony offense of influencing witnesses in violation of OCGA 1610-93B1A in Fulton County, Georgia, by traveling to the home of Ruby Freeman, a Fulton County, Georgia election worker, and speaking to her neighbor with the intent to knowingly engage in misleading conduct toward Ruby Freeman by purporting to offer her help, and with the intent to influence her testimony in an official proceeding in Fulton County, Georgia, concerning events at State Farm Arena on November 3, 2020, presidential election in Georgia. This was an act of racketeering pursuant to OCGA 16435A XXVII and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 88. On or about the 15th day of December 2020, Stephen Cliffgard Lee attempted to commit the felony offense of influencing witnesses in violation of OCGA 1610-93B1A in Fulton County, Georgia, by traveling to the home of Ruby Freeman, a Fulton County, Georgia election worker, and knocking on her door with intent to knowingly engage in misleading conduct toward Ruby Freeman by purporting to offer her help, and with the intent to influence her testimony in an official proceeding in Fulton County, Georgia, concerning events at State Farm Arena on November 3, 2020, presidential election in Georgia. This was an act of racketeering pursuant to the relevant statute and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 89. On the 15th of December 2020 and the 4th of January 2021, Stephen Lee solicited Harrison William Prescott Floyd, an individual associated with the organization Black Voices for Trump, to assist with his effort to speak to Ruby Freeman, a Fulton County, Georgia election worker. Stephen Lee stated to Harrison Floyd that Freeman was afraid to talk to Stephen Lee because he was a white man. These were overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. On the 18th of December 2020, Donald Trump met with Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, unindicted co-conspirator Individual 20, and others at the White House. The individuals present at the meeting discussed certain strategies and theories intended to influence the outcome of the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election, including seizing voting equipment and appointing Sidney Powell as special counsel with broad authority to investigate allegations of voter fraud in Georgia and elsewhere. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 91. On December 21st, 2020, Sidney Powell sent an email to the Chief Operations Officer of Sullivan Stricker LLC and instructed him that she and unindicted co-conspirators individuals 6 and 21 and 22, whose identities are known to the grand jury, were to immediately, quote, receive a copy of all data, end quote, obtained by Sullivan Stricker LLC from Dominion Voting Systems Equipment in Michigan. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 92. On or about the 22nd day of December 2020, Mark Randall Meadows traveled to Cobb County Civic Center in Cobb County, Georgia, and attempted to observe the signature match audit being performed there by law enforcement officers from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State, despite the fact that the audit process was not open to the public. While present at the center, Mark Randall Meadows spoke to Georgia Deputy Secretary of State Jordan Fuchs, Office of the Georgia Secretary of State Chief Investigator Francis Watson, Georgia Bureau of Investigation Special Agent in Charge Bahan Rich, and others who prevented Mark Randall Meadows from entering into the space where the audit was being conducted. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 93. On December 23, 2020, Donald Trump placed a telephone call to the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State Chief Investigation Francis Watson that had been previously arranged by Mark Randall Meadows. During the phone call, Donald Trump falsely stated that he had won the November election for president and by quote, hundreds of thousands of votes, and stated to Watson that, quote, when the right answer comes out, you'll be praised, end quote. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 94. On December 23, 2020, John Eastman sent an email to Kenneth Cheesebro, an unindicted co-conspirator Individual 3, with the subject, Forward, Draft 2 with edits. In the email, John Eastman attached a memorandum titled Privileged and Confidential December 23rd Memo on Jan 6 Scenario Docs, and stated, quote, as for hearings, I think both are unnecessary. The fact that we have multiple slates of electors demonstrates the uncertainty of either. That should be enough, and I agree with Ken that Judiciary Committee hearings on the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act would invite counterviews that we do not believe should constrain Pence or Grassley in the exercise of their power they have under the 12th Amendment. Better for them to just act boldly and be challenged, since the challenge would likely lead to court denying review of non-justiciable political question grounds. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 95. On the 25th of December 2020, Donald Trump placed a telephone call to Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives Rusty Bowers for the purpose of soliciting, requesting, and importuning Bowers to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Arizona. During the call, Bowers stated to Trump, quote, I voted for you, I worked for you, I campaigned for you, I just won't do anything illegal for you, end quote. This telephone call was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 96. On December 27, 2020, Mark Meadows sent a text message to Office of the Georgia Secretary of State Chief Investigator Francis Watson that stated, in part, quote, is there any way to speed up Fulton County signature verification in order to have results before Jan 6th if the Trump campaign assists financially? End quote. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 97. On or about the 27th day of December 2020, Donald Trump solicited acting United States Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and acting United States Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue to make false statements by stating, just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 98. On December 28, 2020, Jeffrey Bussard Clark attempted to commit the felony offense of false statements in writings. in violation of OCGA 16-1020 in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly and willfully making a false writing and document knowing the same to contain the false statement the United States Department of Justice had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have been impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia, end quote. Said statement being within the jurisdiction of the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, departments and agencies of state government, and county and city law enforcement agencies. On December 28, 2020, Jeffrey Buster Clark sent an email to Acting United States Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and Acting United States Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue and requested authorization to send false writing and document to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives David Ralston, and President pro tempore of the Georgia Senate Butch Miller, which constitutes a substantial step toward the commission of false statements and writings, OCGA 16-1020. This was an act of racketeering under OCGA 16-14-35A XXII and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 99. On or about the 28th day of December 2020, Jeffrey Buster Clark solicited Acting United States Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and Acting United States Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue to sign and send a document that falsely stated the United States Department of Justice had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia, end quote. To the Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives David Ralston, and President pro tempore of the Georgia Senate Butch Miller. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 100. On or about the 30th day of December 2020, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account @RealDonaldTrump, quote, hearings from Atlanta on the Georgia election overturned now being broadcast. Check it out at OANN, at Newsmax, and many more. At Brian Kemp, Georgia, should resign from office. He is an obstructionist who refuses to admit that we won Georgia big, also won the other swing states, end quote. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 101. On December 30th, 2020, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, hearings from Atlanta on the Georgia election overturned now being broadcast live via at RSBN Network, and then included a link to the live broadcast, end quote. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 102. On December 30th, 2020, Rudy Giuliani, Ray Smith III, Robert Shealy committed the felony offense of solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in violation of the relevant statutes in Fulton County, Georgia, by soliciting, requesting, and importuning certain public officers then serving as elected members of the Georgia Senate and present at a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting, including unindicted co-conspirator Individual 8, Senator Brandon Beach, Bill Heath, William Ligon, Michael Rett, and Blake Tillery to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by a public officer by unlawfully appointing presidential electors from the state of Georgia in willful and intentional violation of the terms of oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said persons engage in said conduct. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 103. On December 30th, 2020, Rudy Giuliani committed the felony offense of false statements and writings in violation of the relevant statute in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making at least one of the following false statements and representations to members of the Georgia Senate present at a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting. 1. That Fulton County election workers fraudulently counted certain ballots as many as 5 times at State Farm Arena on November 3rd, 2020. That 2,560 felons voted illegally in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia. And 3. That 10,315 dead people voted in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia. Said statements being within the jurisdiction of the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, departments and agencies of state government, and county and city law enforcement agencies. This was an act of racketeering activity under the relevant statute and an act of furtherance in the conspiracy. An overt act in furtherance in the conspiracy. Act 104. On December 30th, 2020, Ray Smith III committed the felony offense of false statements and writings in violation of the relevant statute in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making at least one of the following false statements and representations to members of the Georgia Senate present at the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting. 1. That the Georgia Secretary of State, General Counsel Ryan Germany, stated that his office had sent letters to 8,000 people who voted illegally in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election and told them not to vote in the January 5th, 2021 runoff election. 2. That the Georgia Secretary of State admitted, quote, that they had a 90% accuracy rate, end quote, in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election, and that, quote, there's still a 10% margin that's not accurate, end quote. Such statements being within the jurisdiction of the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, departments and agencies of the state government, and the county and city law enforcement agencies. This was an act of racketeering under OCGA 1614-35A XXII and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Okay, and now as we move on to page 48 and Act 105, which will be for David Shealy, or Robert David Shealy, we see that we still have to go all the way to page 96 or 98, meaning we're about halfway done. And I hope you'll join me for the rest of this. I hope I get a chance to record the rest of this. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll appreciate any support you can give me. I just hit 10 subscribers like an hour ago, and that's pretty cool. So maybe you'll be subscriber number 11. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.